All right, let's talk about something you've probably seen but maybe never fully understood. If you've ever dealt with international shipping, you've seen those weird three-letter codes on a quote or a contract, like FOB, CIF, or DDP. Those are Incoterms, and they're basically the secret language of global trade. So let's crack the code, shall we?
So let's just jump right into the deep end. Imagine this. You've just shipped a huge order to a customer overseas. It's on a massive container ship halfway across the Pacific, and then disaster strikes. The ship goes down. Who's on the hook for that massive loss? Is it you or is it your buyer? It's a terrifying question, and the answer isn't always what you think.
Well, the answer to that nightmare scenario and a dozen other questions about who does what, who pays for what, and who's responsible for what all comes down to just three little letters, the Incoterm you agreed on. It's the simple, standardized rulebook that prevents a whole lot of international arguments.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the big problem that Incoterms were designed to solve. Then, we'll get into the three golden rules that, honestly, once you know them, you'll understand the whole system. After that, we're going to follow a shipment from start to finish, right from the factory, across the ocean, all the way to the final destination, and we'll check out the key rules along the way.
Okay, so before we dive into the specific terms, you've got to understand the framework. Every single one of the 11 official Incoterms is designed to answer three and only three fundamental questions. If you can get your head around these three pillars, you're going to be way ahead of the game.
So here they are. First, obligations. Simple. Who's in charge of what task? Who books the truck? Who handles the customs paperwork? Who arranges the insurance? Second, risk. This is the big one. At what exact physical point is the responsibility for the goods, if they get lost or damaged, transfer from the seller to the buyer? And third, costs. Pretty straightforward. Who is cutting the check for each part of the journey? Every Incoterm defines these three things. That's it.
Now listen up, because this is probably the single most important detail that trips everybody up. You'd think that whoever is paying for the freight is also carrying the risk for that part of the journey, right? Makes sense. But it's not always true. With several of the most common terms, the point where risk transfers and the point up to which the seller pays for transport are two totally different locations. We're going to see this in action in a minute, so keep it in mind.
All right, let's start our journey. We're beginning right at the source, the seller's factory or warehouse. This is where the whole process kicks off.
First up, we have EXW or Xworks. This is the absolute easiest deal for the seller. They basically just put the boxes on their loading dock and say, come and get it. The buyer is responsible for literally everything else: loading the truck, handling export customs in the seller's country, the main shipping, all of it. A word of advice, for international trade, you should probably avoid this one. If the buyer has a problem with customs in a country they don't operate in, your goods are stuck. Big headache.
So a much better option is FCA, or free carrier. With this one, the seller handles loading the goods onto the buyer's truck and, crucially, takes care of the export customs clearance. This totally solves that problem we saw with Xworks. For a lot of situations, FCA is the perfect, modern rule to use when the buyer wants to manage their own shipping.
Okay, the goods are packed, customs is cleared, and the truck has left the factory. Now we're heading into the main leg of the journey, the big one. This could be by ship, plane, train. This is where things get a little more complex.
And before we go any further, you have to know this. The official Incoterms are split into two distinct categories. One group can be used for any type of transport. The other group is only for sea and inland waterway transport. And really it's meant for bulk stuff like grain or oil, not for modern container shipping. Using a sea-only term for a container shipment is a classic mistake. Seriously, it can actually void your insurance if something goes wrong.
All right, let's look at CPT, which stands for Carriage Paid To. Here, the seller arranges and pays for the main shipping all the way to the destination. But, and here's that split we talked about, look where the risk transfers. The moment the goods are handed over to the first trucking company or airline in the seller's country, the risk passes to the buyer. So the seller pays for the whole journey, but the buyer is on the hook if the ship sinks. See how that works?
Now, if you get CPT, then CIP is super easy. It's almost the exact same deal. Seller pays for freight, risk transfers early. The only difference is that extra I, and you guessed it, it stands for insurance. Under CIP, the seller is also obligated to buy insurance to cover the buyer's risk during the main transit.
And this rule got a really important update back in 2020.
Now, when a seller uses CIP, they have to purchase a much higher level of insurance. It's called All Risk or Institute Cargo Clauses A coverage. This gives the buyer a lot more protection than the old minimum cover rules did. It's a big improvement.
Okay, let's tackle the elephant in the room. FOB, or free on board. People love to use this term, but it is probably the most misused Incoterm of them all. Here's the bottom line. You should not be using FOB for container shipments. Why? Because under FOB, risk only transfers when the goods are physically loaded on board the vessel. But when you ship a container, you drop it at the terminal days before it gets loaded. All that time it's sitting there, you're in a risky gray area. Just use FCA instead. It's what it was designed for.
So our shipment has survived the main journey, it's arrived at the port or airport in the buyer's country, and now we're on the home stretch. We're talking about the final mile, getting the goods from the terminal to the buyer's actual address.
A super common term you'll see here is DAP, delivered at place. This means the seller handles everything. They get the goods off the ship, through the port, onto a truck, and they drive it right up to the buyer's front door. The seller's job ends the moment that truck arrives ready to be unloaded. The buyer's responsible for unloading it and for all the import customs and taxes. Now there's DPU, or delivered at place unloaded. This one is really easy to remember. It's exactly the same as DAP with one extra step. The seller is also responsible for unloading the goods. This is the one and only Incoterm where the seller has to unload the shipment.
And last but not least, we have DDP, delivered duty paid. The easiest way to think about this is that it's the Amazon Prime of global trade. The seller does absolutely everything. They handle all the shipping, all the customs clearance, and they even pay all the import duties and taxes in the buyer's country. It's maximum convenience for the buyer. But a word of warning for sellers, don't you dare use this unless you are legally set up to handle taxes in the destination country. It can get very messy.
Okay, so we've been on a whirlwind tour of the entire journey. We've seen how responsibility can shift at every step. So the big question is, how do you actually choose the right one for your business? Let's get practical.
This chart really shows the whole story at a glance. Think of it like a seesaw. On one end, with EXW, all the weight of responsibility is on the buyer. As you move down the list through terms like FCA and CIP and towards DAP and DDP, you can literally see that weight, the obligations, the risks, and the costs shifting systematically from the buyer's side over to the seller's side.
So let's boil it down. If you are a buyer, what's your best move? In most modern shipping scenarios, FCA is your best friend. It lets you control the main, most expensive part of the shipping, so you can shop around for good rates. But it leaves the tricky export customs part to the seller, who's in the best position to handle it. It's the best of both worlds.
And what if you're the one selling the goods? Well, CIP or DAP often hits that commercial sweet spot. You get to control the whole logistics process, which means you can offer your customer a simple all-in delivery price. But you smartly pass the unpredictable headache of import customs and taxes onto the buyer, who is in their own country and best equipped to deal with it.
So at the end of the day, that's all an Incoterm really is. It's a clear, agreed-upon point in the journey where the seller passes the baton of responsibility over to the buyer. It's a strategic decision about how much control you want, how much risk you're willing to take, and how much service you want to provide. So, now that you know the rules of the race, the only question left is, where are you going to make the handover?